On a boundary line in the English countryside, sometime around the year 900, a burial party did everything wrong on purpose. The man they were putting in the ground went in face down. His wrists were still bound behind his back. His head had come off at the block or the gallows side, and whoever filled in the grave set it down beside his knees, and then the party walked away and left him there. Outside every churchyard, beyond every prayer, on the exact line where one territory ended and the next began. Archaeologists have found whole cemeteries like that ringing the edges of Anglo-Saxon England, pits of the hanged and the beheaded, buried face down, or bound, or tucked into some old pagan burial mound, so they'd spend eternity in the worst company the landscape offered. Punishment in this world was not required to stop at death. Europe in the centuries after Roman power fell apart in the West, roughly 500 to 1000, the stretch everybody calls the Dark Ages. Historians mostly hate the name now, and fair enough, plenty of remarkable things happened in those centuries. But I want to take the insult at face value for the next couple of hours. If you were dropped into that world tomorrow morning with your soft hands and your sealed vaccines, how long would you actually last? A year? A month? The title has already tipped my hand. I genuinely think most of us would be in serious trouble before the first sunset, and I don't mean that as a thought experiment about swords and Vikings, although we will absolutely get to the Vikings. I mean the water, the bread, the tooth that's been aching in the back of your mouth for a week, the night itself. This world had about 40 different ways to kill you, most of them quiet. And the man on the boundary line, whatever he did, at least understood the rules he broke. You wouldn't even have that. Before we get into it, quick pause for the housekeeping. Welcome in, whether you're new here or you've been around for a while. This one is long, so get comfortable and do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I genuinely enjoy scrolling through those. It's a strange little map of who's out there at 2 in the morning with a history video on. Massive thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. If you want to join them, everything is down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the dark. Dawn, early spring. You wake up on a straw mattress on a packed earth floor, and the first thing that hits you is the smell, because you are sharing roughly 40 square meters with between 5 and 10 other people, and depending on the season, the family cow. That's not an exaggeration for effect. Across much of Northern Europe, houses were built as longhouses with people at one end and livestock at the other, sometimes with a low partition between, often without. The animals were kept inside partly for security, and partly because their body heat was the central heating. In January, a cow in the house was the difference between a cold night and a dangerous one. The trade was that you lived in their air, their dung, their urine soaking into the floor, their breath, their flies. The fire in the middle of the room has burned down to embers overnight, and someone has to coax it back to life, because matches are 11 centuries away, and losing your fire entirely means begging coals off a neighbor. Above that fire hangs the other thing you'd notice within a minute of waking, and it would stay with you for the rest of your short life here. Smoke. These houses had no chimneys. The smoke from the hearth drifted up into the rafters and found its way out through the thatch or a small hole slowly, which meant everyone in the building spent every evening and every winter day breathing it. Archaeologists who study early medieval skeletons keep finding the signature of this in the bones of the face. Chronic maxillary sinusitis, inflammation of the sinuses severe enough and long enough to leave pits and spurs of new bone inside the skull, shows up constantly in these cemeteries, in men, in women, and in children, small enough that they'd barely had time to grow the sinuses being destroyed. Your eyes would sting by supper. Your lungs would rattle by 40 if you saw 40. Nobody in this house has slept alone, and nobody has slept clean. Bedding is straw or bracken, refreshed a few times a year, and it is inhabited. Fleas, bedbugs, lice, all three kinds of lice. And I'm sorry to report that the distinction matters, because body lice carry typhus and relapsing fever, and everybody had them. Delousing a family member by hand, by firelight, was a normal evening activity across the entire period, the way scrolling a phone is now. Combs are among the most common personal objects archaeologists pull out of early medieval settlements, from peasant huts to royal graves, and they were not for style. Fine-toothed on one side, for dragging the eggs out. The lice had a lot of surface to work with, because washing, in the full immersion sense, was an occasional event rather than a routine. Soap existed, a harsh boiled paste of ashes and animal fat that the Gauls had been making since before Caesar. And people did rinse hands and faces, and river bathing happened in summer, and the better monasteries kept to a schedule of a few baths a year, with extra allowances for the sick. Heating enough water for a genuine wash meant hauling it by the bucket and burning a meaningful pile of fuel. So for a labouring family in February, the calculation answered itself. Clothing pressed the same way. Most people owned one working outfit of wool and maybe linen, worn daily, slept in through the cold months, patched until the patches needed patches, and wool that's been worked in, rained on, and dried by a dung-scented fire for a year, acquires a biography you could smell across a room. Except that nobody could smell it, because every room and every person carried the same one. Visitors from the perfumed cities of the Islamic world, when they met Northern Europeans, tended to remark on exactly this. And Ibn Fadlan, a man we'll be spending serious time with later in this video, described the Rus he met as physically magnificent, and then, in nearly the same breath, as the filthiest of God's creatures. The grime wasn't neglect exactly. It was the honest cost of heat, water, and time in a world where all three were expensive, and it meant every scratch, every blister, every insect bite opened into skin that hadn't been clean in months, in clothing that hadn't either, and we've already established what this world could and couldn't do about infection. So that's the first 2 minutes of your day, and nothing has even happened yet. Now you're thirsty, and thirst, in this world, is where the real trouble starts. The village well, if the village has one, sits maybe 30 paces from the nearest rubbish pit, and the rubbish pit is doing double duty as the latrine. Nobody dug these things with groundwater flow in mind, because nobody knew groundwater flowed. Rain lands on the midden, soaks down through a season of human waste, animal dung, butchery scraps and dead dogs, and finds its way sideways into the same water table the well is drinking from. In summer, when the water level drops, the concentration goes up. Every mouthful you take is a gamble against typhoid, dysentery, and a rotating cast of parasites, and you can't see, smell, or taste most of what's in there. A perfectly clear cup of well water could be carrying enough to kill you inside 2 weeks. People did understand, in a rough, practical way, that some water was bad. They drank ale and weak beer in enormous quantities, and part of the reason those drinks were safer had nothing to do with the alcohol, which was thin, but with the fact that brewing meant boiling. A household that drank mostly ale was a household that accidentally sterilized a good portion of its fluid intake. But ale takes grain, and grain is food, and in a lean spring the choice between brewing your barley and eating it is not really a choice. The poorest people and the youngest children drank the water, which goes some way toward explaining what the water did to the youngest children. And we'll sit with that properly a bit later, because the numbers around early medieval childhood are the bleakest thing in this whole video. First though, the worms. In 1972, archaeologists excavating a Viking Age site at Coppergate in York found, among the workshops and the wattle fences, a single human stool, fossilized, 20 centimeters long, deposited by some anonymous 9th century resident and preserved in the wet ground for over 1,000 years. It's known, with the dignity only British archaeology can supply, as the Lloyds Bank coprolite, after the bank whose new building was going up on the site. Paleopathologists went through it under a microscope and found it loaded with eggs, whipworm and moorworm, hundreds of eggs, from a gut carrying a heavy double infestation of intestinal parasites. And the thing about that stool is that it isn't unusual, it's typical. Wherever researchers sample early medieval latrine soil, cesspits and burial abdomens anywhere in Europe, the same eggs come up in quantity. Roundworms that grow to the length of your hand and live by the dozen in the small intestine. Whipworms burrowed into the wall of the colon. Tapeworms from undercooked pork and beef, some species reaching several meters, coiled inside a living person going about their day. Realistically, if you're standing in that Frankish village, every adult around you is carrying something, most are carrying several somethings, and so are you within a month of arriving. A heavy roundworm load in a well-fed adult means cramps, nausea, and the occasional horror of passing or vomiting a live worm. In a malnourished child, it means the parasites are eating a meaningful share of what little food goes in, and the child slowly loses a race it doesn't know it's running. Worms, at least, mostly kill slowly. The waterborne bacteria did not. Dysentery, which the sources call the bloody flux, was the great routine killer of this entire period. So common that chroniclers note it the way we note a bad flu season. It starts as cramping and diarrhea, and then the lining of the large intestine begins to slough and bleed, and within a day or two the victim is passing blood and mucus 20, 30 times a day, burning with fever, unable to keep water down while losing liters of it. People died of it in 3 days, or lingered for 2 weeks, hollowed out, and in a one-room house with no plumbing. Nursing a dysentery patient meant handling infected waste with your bare hands next to the family food supply, so it tore through households and then through villages. It was flatly democratic about it too. Armies on campaign lost more men to the flux than to enemy weapons, camped as they were around their own latrines in summer heat. Kings died of it in their beds. In 580, an epidemic of it swept Frankish Gaul, and our best witness for that whole world, a bishop named Gregory of Tours, watched it happen and wrote it down. Gregory describes the victims gripped by high fever, vomiting, terrible pain in the kidneys and the belly, and he says the disease fell hardest on the small children, and that they died in numbers that emptied houses. He wrote a line about losing little ones who were sweet and dear to him, and how it left a wound that stays. This from a man who spent his career cataloguing assassinations without flinching. That same epidemic reached the top of Frankish society, and what happened there is worth a minute, because it says a lot about how helpless everyone was, top to bottom. King Chilperic and Queen Fredegund, two people we will meet again in far worse circumstances, had two young sons, and in 580 both boys caught the flux. Fredegund, one of the most feared and frankly murderous political figures of the century, broke down as they sickened. Gregory reports her turning on the pile of tax registers, the records of all the new levies squeezed out of the poor, and telling her husband that God had been punishing them for it, that they kept heaping up gold while losing the one thing gold couldn't buy back. They burned the registers, they forgave the taxes, it made no difference. The younger boy died first, and the older, Clodebert, was carried through the summer night to the shrine of Sainte Médard at Soissons, and laid by the tomb, his parents making vows over him, and he died there around midnight. A king and queen of the Franks had exactly the same medical options as the family in your village longhouse: prayer, a shrine, and watching, which raises the question of what medicine, so-called, could actually offer in this world, and the honest answer runs somewhere between nothing and actively making things worse. The framework underneath all of it, inherited from the classical world in half-remembered fragments, was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Sickness meant the humours were out of balance, and the cure meant draining off the excess, so the frontline treatment for almost anything, fever, headache, madness, a difficult pregnancy, was to open a vein and let the patient bleed into a bowl. A sick body already fighting an infection would be relieved of a pint of the blood it needed, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes until fainting, since fainting was taken as the sign the balance had been restored. Surviving manuscripts include careful calendars for this, tables of so-called Egyptian days, unlucky dates when bleeding would kill, and lucky ones when it would heal, all of it worked out from the moon. None of it worked out from the body. We do have their recipe books, and they're a strange mix. The best known from the Anglo-Saxon world is Bald's Leech Book, compiled in the 9th or 10th century, a physician's working manual. Some of it is herbs steeped in ale for conditions that would have gotten better anyway. Some of it is charms, words to sing over the wound, because in this world disease had agents, and one of the recognized agents was elves. Sudden stabbing pain, the sort we'd call a cramp or a stitch or maybe a herniated disc, was elf shot, an invisible arrow fired into you by invisible beings, and the Leech Book has the treatment. Part herbal salve, part spoken spell to send the arrow back. I'm not raising that to sneer at it. If you had no microscope, and pain arrived out of a clear sky in a healthy body. An unseen arrow was a reasonable model. It just wasn't a treatment. And here's the twist that keeps historians of medicine humble. A few years ago, microbiologists rebuilt one leech book remedy exactly as written, an eye salve of garlic, leek, wine, and ox gall, brewed in a brass vessel and left to stand 9 nights, and tested it on modern drug-resistant staph bacteria. It killed them. Whoever assembled that recipe had, through generations of trial and error, stumbled onto a genuinely potent antimicrobial. So the picture isn't that these people were stupid. The picture is that they were intelligent people locked out of the one fact that mattered, that disease is caused by living things too small to see, and without that fact, 1,000 years of careful observation still left them bleeding fever patients by the phase of the moon. Surgery existed, and I use the word loosely, for a shattered limb going bad, amputation, with the patient held down by several strong men, awake, because effective anesthesia did not exist. Wine, maybe a draught with henbane or poppy in it if the healer was well supplied, none of it close to enough. The cut had to be fast, the vessels seared shut with irons from the fire, and the survivors then faced the infection lottery with no antiseptics beyond wine, vinegar, and honey. Honey, at least, genuinely helps. Another accident of trial and error. And then at the far end of the scale, trepanation, cutting or scraping a hole through the living skull to relieve pressure or release whatever was thought to be trapped inside. Early medieval cemeteries across Europe turn up skulls with these holes, and the remarkable thing is how many of them show smoothed, healed bone around the edges. The patients lived, sometimes for years, sometimes through more than one operation. Somebody scraped through your skull with an iron blade by firelight. No anesthetic, no sterilization. And you survived it, walked around your village with a soft spot in your head, and eventually died of something else. The human body's tolerance for punishment in this period is genuinely hard to fathom. It had to be. Where did the sick actually go then, when home remedies failed and no surgeon was within reach or within courage? They went to the saints, and this is one place where the sources are magnificent, because Gregory of Tours, our bishop, spent decades keeping registers of the cures at the shrine of St. Martin in his own cathedral city, and the registers are, whatever else they are, a census of illness. Around the tomb, on any given day, camped the paralyzed, carried there on the backs of kinsmen from days away. The blind, cataracts and infections and injuries all filed together under one word. Epileptics. The possessed in the era's classification, chained sometimes for their own protection, waiting through the nights near the holy dust. People with contracted, clawed hands and withered limbs, with fistulas and tumours and fevers that had burned for months. The whole catalogue of what this video has been describing, gathered at the one institution that would take all of them. And it functioned in its way. It was shelter, it was arms and food, it was the only long-term care facility the West had, and Gregory records cure after cure at the festivals, the crowds pressing in, the dust from the tomb drunk in water as medicine, sight returning, limbs unlocking, and you can supply whatever mix of remission, psychology, and rest, plus regular meals you find plausible. The people involved supplied St. Martin. The shrines were the hospitals. The monasteries came to run the closest thing to actual infirmaries, with herb gardens laid out by written plan, a designated bleeding house, a room for the dying, and monks assigned to nursing as a sacred duty. And if you had to be sick anywhere in this half of the world, sick inside a monastery wall was the best draw available. Your village had the other version, a wise neighbor, a charm, a vein opened by the moon, and the long road to Tours. Hold that thought about pain, actually, because your mouth deserves its own moment here. The stereotype says medieval teeth were rotten, and the archaeology says something more interesting and in a way worse. Cavities were fairly rare because sugar barely existed in this diet and honey was a luxury. What the skeletons show instead is wear. The daily bread was ground on stone querns, and stone querns shed grit, fine sand and stone dust baked into every loaf, so every meal was a light sanding of the teeth. By middle age, and middle age here means 35, many people had ground their molars flat, down through the enamel, down to the soft dentine, and in the worst cases, down into the pulp chamber where the nerve lives. An open pulp chamber in a mouthful of bacteria means abscess. Jawbones from these cemeteries are pocked with abscess cavities, some with drainage channels where the pus ate its own tunnel out through the bone of the face. That's a level of dental pain most modern people have never approached, endured without any relief beyond clove, prayer, and eventually a man with iron pliers and a knee on your chest. And an untreated abscess isn't just pain. The infection can track down into the floor of the mouth and the throat, swell it shut and suffocate you, or slip into the bloodstream and stop your heart as sepsis. People in this world died with some regularity of a tooth. A bad tooth, though, you could at least see coming. The sickness that stalked this entire period gave nobody any warning at all, and it deserves the next stretch of this video to itself, because it returned wave after wave for 200 years, and because our best witness, Gregory of Tours, stood in its path more than once and set down exactly what it did to the places it visited. The pestilence came through in visitations, one every generation or so from the mid-500s deep into the 700s, and the chroniclers set it apart from every fever and flux they knew because of how it announced itself on the body. Gregory describes the mark. A victim developed a wound in the groin or the armpit, he says, something like the bite of a snake, a hard burning swelling, and from that point the poison had them, raging fever, delirium, death on the second or third day. Anyone who lasted past the third day had a chance. Few were given the third day. Over his shoulder, we can name the thing bubonic plague, the same organism that would return centuries later as the Black Death, his snake bites the infected lymph nodes ballooning as the bacteria took the bloodstream, and it travelled then the way it travelled later, in the fleas of black rats, riding grain sacks and cargo bales and river barges along every trade artery still functioning. Nobody on earth suspected the rats. The theory of the age blamed corrupted air, and against bad air, the only medicine anyone could prescribe was distance. In 571, it climbed into the Auvergne, into Clermont, Gregory's own home country, and his account of that season is one long funeral. The mortality ran so hot that entire households went together, houses left standing with no one alive inside them. Coffins ran out, then planks ran out, and the dead went into trenches, 10 and more at a time. On a single Sunday, in one church in Clermont, 300 corpses were counted, laid out and waiting for ground. Everyone with somewhere to go fled for the hills, and among those who stayed, Gregory singles out a priest named Cato, a man he'd criticized in other chapters as vain and ambitious, who now refused every chance to leave, and buried the dead of his city one after another, and kept saying the Mass over them, right up until the swelling rose under his own arm. Gregory, no friend of his, filed the death under courage, and in 588 it walked into Marseille off a ship, and Gregory's report of that outbreak traces the mechanics so cleanly you can watch him get within one step of solving it. A merchant vessel from Spain docked with its usual cargo. A household in the city bought from that cargo, and 8 people of that house were dead almost at once. The thing went quiet, then went house to house until the whole city, he says, was blazing with the disease the way a cornfield burns. The bishop shut himself inside the Basilica of St. Victor with a handful of the devout and prayed through it. Everyone who could leave left, and Marseille stood open and dying for 2 months. And then the sickness burned out, and the people came home, and it caught again off the embers and made a second harvest out of the returners. A ship, a cargo, a first house, a sequence, all of it observed and written down in order by a careful man, and the missing step was a flea. Distance really was the only medicine, and Marseille shows what distance was worth once the thing got inside the walls. Gregory's own deacon happened to be in Rome in 590, when the pestilence was working through that city and had just killed the Pope, and the scene he brought home rounds out the picture of what anyone, anywhere, could actually do. The Romans organized enormous penitential processions, the whole population marshaled into columns and sent circling the city chanting for mercy, and the deacon reported that the plague kept pace with the prayers, that in the space of a single hour, while the columns walked, 80 people dropped dead in the streets mid-procession, and that the man directing it all, a monk named Gregory, who was about to be dragged, genuinely protesting, onto the papal throne as Gregory the Great, kept the columns moving past the bodies. Prayer conducted over the dying, interrupted by the dying, resumed over the dead. If you want the whole period's medical situation in one image, that procession is available. It reached Britain too, on the far edge of the known world. The island's great historian, a monk named Bede, writing in the early 700s, describes the pestilence of 664, which fell on a single day, if the record is right about it, that also carried off both the King of Kent and the Archbishop of Canterbury, July the 14th. It moved north through the English kingdoms and emptied monasteries the way it had emptied the towns of Gaul. Bede tells one story from that outbreak that I'll pass along, because it lands harder than any casualty figure. A bishop named Cedd died of the plague at his monastery at Lastingham, up in the Yorkshire moors. When word reached the community of monks he'd founded down in Essex, about 30 of them decided to travel north, to live out their lives near their father's body. And they made the journey, and they settled in at Lastingham, and the plague that had killed Ced was still in the place, and it killed them. All of them, Bede says, except one small boy. And that boy lived on at the monastery for years, and it was only discovered much later, Bede reports, that the boy had never been baptized, which to the people around him explained everything, that death had passed over him because he wasn't yet on the rolls, so to speak, and he was promptly baptized as an adult. You can take from that story the piety Bede intended, or you can take from it the image of a child in an empty monastery, the sole survivor of 30, growing up among the graves of every adult he'd followed there. Both are true at once. Plague, at least, announced itself, and it eventually left. Other diseases moved in permanently and worked on a longer clock. Smallpox was circulating in this world. Epidemics of burning fever and pustules turn up in the chronicles of 6th century Gaul and Italy, blinding some survivors and pitting the faces of the rest. Tuberculosis was everywhere, in the lungs and, from untreated milk, in the bones, and early medieval skeletons show its signature, collapsed and fused vertebrae, bending spines into the hunched question mark the disease carves when it eats the spine of a growing child. And then, slowest of all, leprosy, the one that took your body apart while insisting you stay alive to watch. The bacterium kills nerve endings, so the hands and feet go numb, and a numb hand in a world of open fires, sickles and boiling pots destroys itself through 1,000 unfelt injuries, wounds that go unnoticed until they're infected, infections that cost fingers, then toes, then more. The face changes as the disease works on it, the bridge of the nose collapsing inward, the brow thickening, and skeletons from early medieval cemeteries show exactly this pattern in the bone, the eroded nasal opening, the pitted palate, the resorbed finger bones tapering to points. What made leprosy uniquely dreadful, though, wasn't only the disease. In most communities, the diagnosis carried a social death that arrived years before the physical one. The infected person was moved outside, out of the house, eventually out of the settlement, to live at the margins on charity, ringing or calling a warning when the healthy came near. In the centuries after our period, this got formalized into an actual funeral rite performed over the still living leper, but the exclusion itself is old. You'd be alive, and you'd already be a ghost. Sooner or later, though, in this world, the thing most likely to empty your village wasn't any single disease. It was the harvest. And the years when the harvest failed produced some of the most genuinely disturbing testimony that survives from the entire early medieval period. So consider this your warning that the next stretch of this video is heavy going even by the standards of what you've already heard. Subsistence farming means exactly what it says. You grow what you eat what you grow, and the margin between the two in a normal year was thin enough that historians estimate many peasant households consumed most of their harvest and kept back just enough seed grain to plant the next one. That seed grain sat in the house all winter, in a sack, while the family went hungry a few feet away from it, because eating the seed meant eating next year. Yields were pitiful by any modern measure. A farmer scattering seed by hand on soil worked with an ox, and a scratch plough could expect back maybe 3 or 4 grains for everyone planted in a good year on good land. One of those grains went back in the ground. So the whole calculation of staying alive rested on a couple of multiplication factors that the weather could erase in a single wet August. One failed harvest meant a hungry year, eating the seed, eating the plough ox, eating acorns and bark bread and boiled grass. Two failed harvests in a row meant famine. And the climate of this period, especially in the grim, hungry stretches of the 6th and 9th centuries, kept dealing out exactly that hand. The chronicles record these famines in a flat, exhausted shorthand, a great hunger, so that many died. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes a severe famine in Britain in 793, the same year as certain other events on that island that we'll come to shortly, and the annalists clearly saw the two as connected omens. The Frankish annals log hunger after hunger through the 800s as civil war and raiding tore up the farming calendar. Even the years the chronicles never bothered to mark were hungry at the edges, because the farming year had a built-in starving season. By late spring the stores were scraping bottom, the new harvest stood months off, and households crossed the gap on pottage thinned a little further each week. On bread eked out with beans and vetches, the pig kept alive because killing it early meant no winter fat, and the youngest weaned children taking the shortage hardest, since everyone in the house was rationing except the worms we met earlier. Children raised on that calendar carried it in their skeletons for life. Arrest lines in the teeth and the long bones, laid down like tree rings, one ring for every lean spring the growing body barely crossed. A chronicle famine was that gap breaking its banks and swallowing the whole year, and the English annals give 976 a single flat line, the great hunger among the English, and move on. The entry historians keep returning to, though, comes from a monk named Rodolphus Glaber, writing in Burgundy just after the year 1000, technically a step past our window, but describing a world that hadn't changed 1 inch, and describing it at length, because the famine he lived through, around the 1030s, broke something in the people around him, and he felt someone should put it in writing. 3 years of rain, he says, rain at planting, rain at harvest, fields that couldn't be worked because the furrows were ponds, grain that sprouted and rotted standing up. The poor ate the green shoots in the fields, then the roots, then grass and riverweed. The price of what grain remained went vertical, and Glaber describes rich men gnawing bark alongside beggars, and the specific look of famine bodies, the skin drawn tight and yellowing, the belly swelling as the limbs waste, the voice thinning to a wheeze. Wolves came out of the forests, he says, drawn by the unburied dead, and grew bold enough to take the living. And then he gets to the part he clearly didn't want to write. When the animals and the bark were gone, he says, men began to eat men. Travellers on the roads were murdered for their flesh by hosts who had offered them a bed. Families killed at inns, cooked and eaten by the innkeepers. People lured children away, he says, with an egg or a piece of fruit held out, the way you'd coax a stray dog, and the children were eaten. Graves were opened at night, and the dead pulled back out of the ground to feed the living. In the market at Taunus, a man was caught selling cooked human flesh alongside ordinary meat, laid out on the stall as if that were a thing a market sold, and the crowd, Whatever it had been driven to privately could not bear the sight of it made public and commercial. He was seized and burned alive. Another man, Glaber says, crept to the spot afterward, dug the buried flesh back up and ate it, and was burned in his turn. And out in the forest near Mâcon, a hermit's hut by a lonely chapel became a rumour, then an investigation, and inside it were found the severed heads of 48 men, women and children, the remains of travellers who had stopped at a holy man's door for shelter over the course of the famine. He was taken to Mâcon and burned. Glaber says he saw the man's execution with his own eyes. Now chroniclers exaggerate and monks moralize, and this monk more than most, so hold each individual anecdote as loosely as you feel you need to. But famine cannibalism is not a medieval invention. It's a documented human behavior in every century that has starved badly enough, including the 20th, and Glaber's account sounds far less like a sermon than like a man reporting court cases. The 48 heads have the terrible specificity of a number somebody counted. Even in years when the harvest technically came in, the grain itself could turn on you. And this next disease might be the single most nightmarish thing in this entire video, so brace yourself. Rye was the bread grain of the poor across huge stretches of northern Europe, hardy stuff that grows where wheat sulks, and rye is uniquely hospitable to a fungus called ergot, which replaces the grain kernels with hard purple-black spurs. Wet summer, contaminated harvest, and the spurs get milled into the flour along with everything else, invisible in dark bread. Ergot's alkaloids do two things to a human body, and different outbreaks leaned different ways. The first is convulsive, twisting muscle spasms, limbs jerking and locking, the sensation of ants swarming under the skin, and raging hallucinations, because among ergot's chemical children is lysergic acid, the direct precursor of LSD. Entire villages, eating from the same contaminated harvest, would descend together into weeks of seizures and shared visions of fire and demons, and they had no framework for that except the obvious one, that hell had opened under the parish. The second form is gangrenous, and it's worse. The alkaloids clamp the blood vessels shut, starting at the extremities, and the tissue begins to die while its owner is alive and watching. It starts as burning, an unbearable heat in the feet and hands, as if they were held in invisible fire, and the era's name for the disease came straight from that sensation, the holy fire, ignis sacer. Then the burning limb goes cold and black and mummifies, dry and hard, dead flesh on a living person, and eventually, at the ankle, at the knee, at the wrist, it separates. Chronicles describe sufferers whose limbs detached at the joints without an axe ever touching them. The Annals of Xanten, recording an outbreak along the Rhine in 857, describe a great plague of blistering rot consuming the people, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. Run that clause past yourself again, slowly, before death. The disease took your legs and left you alive to consider the arrangement. In 994, an outbreak tore through Aquitaine in southern France, and the chroniclers there put the dead at 40,000, with churches filling up with the burned and the limbless crawling to altars because a saint's shrine was the only pharmacy on offer. Some outbreaks eased when the sufferers gathered at monasteries, and the monks credited the saint, though the quieter reason may simply be that the monastery kitchen baked its bread from clean wheat in the granary rather than the poisoned rye at home. Eat somewhere else, and the fire goes out. Nobody could see that mechanism. They could only see the fire. Sit with the position this puts our time traveler in, by the way. You know about ergot now. You know about the wells and the worms, and it buys you almost nothing because your knowledge has no leverage. You can't test the flour. You can't boil every cup of water over a fire you have to feed by hand while also earning your bread. You'd know exactly what was killing you in precise modern vocabulary while it killed you at the medieval rate. In some ways, that's a darker fate than your neighbours, who at least had the mercy of blaming elves. Hunger and disease worked on everyone, but they pressed hardest on the two groups this world manufactured in enormous numbers and spent almost as fast, mothers and infants. What childbirth meant here needs its own space, and I'll be straightforward with you. This next section contains some of the most painful material of the whole video, not because it's gory in the battlefield sense, but because every part of it happened in somebody's home over and over for 500 years. A woman in your Frankish village who survived to marrying age, call it 15 or 16, faced a reproductive career of roughly 20 years, and with no reliable contraception beyond extended breastfeeding and luck that typically meant somewhere between 5 and 10 pregnancies. Each one was a separate roll of the dice, and the dice were weighted in ways she knew intimately, because she had watched her mother, her sisters, and her neighbours take the same roles. Historians working from skeletal populations and later parish records generally put the risk of death per birth somewhere in the low single digits, 1 or 2 in 100, which sounds survivable until you run it across a whole childbearing life, at which point a woman's cumulative odds of dying in or shortly after childbirth land in the neighbourhood of 1 in 10, and in some communities, worse. Early medieval cemeteries bear this out in the plainest way possible. A persistent surplus of women dead between 18 and 35, the exact years men their age were surviving fine. What actually killed them splits into a few mechanisms, all of them fully understood today, and all of them untouchable then. The first was obstruction. A childhood of malnutrition, rickets from dark, smoky houses and poor diets, could leave a woman with a pelvis subtly deformed, narrowed, flattened, and when the baby's head could not pass through it, labor simply did not end. It went on for 2 days, 3 days, 4. Contractions grinding against an impossible geometry, and everyone in the room, the mother most of all, gradually understanding what was happening because they had all seen it before. A surgical delivery that both patients survive was 1,000 years away. Caesarean section existed in this world only as a desperate act performed on a mother already dead or dying, in the hope of baptizing the child before it followed her. When the mother's life was the priority and the child was already lost, the midwife's final resort, and it's recorded in the medical texts of the age without euphemism, was to take hooks and knives and remove the child from her body in pieces. Some mothers survived that. Given what it was performed with and where, many did not. The second killer worked in the days after a birth that had seemed to go well. Childbed fever, puerperal fever, an infection of the birth canal and womb introduced by unwashed hands and unclean cloths during delivery, and here the tragedy has a particularly bitter edge, because the more help a laboring woman had, the more hands, the more intervention, the more chances the bacteria got. The fever set in on the second or third day, with rigors and a soaring temperature and pain through the abdomen, and once it tipped into the bloodstream it killed within the week. A young woman burning and lucid, with a living newborn beside her that she grew too weak to nurse. It's the same infection that would still be slaughtering new mothers in the gleaming hospitals of the 1800s, until a doctor was mocked out of his profession for suggesting that physicians wash their hands. In a 6th century longhouse it didn't even have a name, and behind those two stood the quieter mechanisms: hemorrhage that no one could stop, eclampsia, the retained afterbirth turning septic. Archaeologists periodically excavate the outcome directly, graves holding a young woman with a full-term infant lying in her pelvis, dead together in labor, and occasionally something they call coffin birth, where the fetus is found positioned below the pelvis, expelled after burial by the gases of the mother's decomposition. The earth finishing blindly, the delivery that killed them both. The baby's own odds barely improve once out. The best estimates for this period, drawn from cemetery demography across Europe, suggest that roughly 1 infant in 4 or 5 died before their first birthday, and that only around half of all children born were still alive at 10. Half. Every mother in your village who raised 4 children buried, on average, 3 or 4 others. And this wasn't the private lightning strike grief it is now. It was the weather. The killers were the ones you've already met: dysentery in the summer, the coughing diseases in the winter, plague when plague came, plus the specific hazards of being small in a house built around an open fire and a farmyard, the hearth, the well, the pond, the pig. An animal perfectly willing to take a toddler if one wandered into reach, and later court records from the medieval countryside show exactly that happening at intervals. Families answered the arithmetic the only way available, by having many children and holding each one provisionally. You can see the provisionality in the sources, in the rush to baptize newborns within days or hours, because an unbaptized child, in the theology everyone shared, died outside the community of the saved, and you can see it in the cemeteries, where infants are sometimes buried apart, along the walls, at the edges, in the eaves, drip of the church where the water running off the holy roof might do for them what the font hadn't gotten the chance to. One more thing belongs in this section, and it should be said carefully. Not every dead infant in this world died of disease. Exposure of newborns, the abandonment of children a family could not or would not feed, was an inheritance from the classical world, where it had been legal and routine, and the early medieval church spent centuries campaigning against it, in sermons, in law codes, in penitential handbooks that assigned specific penances for mothers who overlaid or made away with infants. Institutions grew up in response that tell you the practice never stopped. Foundling arrangements at church doors, the marble shell placed outside a cathedral where a child could be left anonymously rather than left in the woods. And the law codes and penitentials repeatedly, uncomfortably, scale their penalties by circumstance, treating the starving mother in a famine year differently from the prosperous one, because the men writing them knew exactly what a famine year did to a household's choices. The historians who work on this subject argue over scale and can't settle it, since the act by its nature left the thinnest of records. What the records do preserve is a world in which the question came up often enough to need standing answers. Suppose you dodge all of it, though. The well, the worms, the plague, the birth that kills your wife or you. In this world you are still, every single day, one insult away from a category of danger we haven't touched yet, the deliberate kind. Violence in the early medieval centuries wasn't a breakdown of the system. In large stretches of life, it was the system. And the sources for it are so rich and so appalling that historians have been dining out on them for 300 years. Time to meet the neighbours properly. Open almost any early medieval law code, and you find, before anything resembling constitutional principle, a price list for the human body. The laws of Ethelbert of Kent, set down around the year 600 and the oldest surviving document in the English language, run through it with the calm of an insurance schedule. An eye struck out, 50 shillings. An ear struck off, 12. Each of the 4 front teeth, 6 shillings. The teeth beside them 4, and so on down the jaw. Every tooth in your head individually priced. A thumb, 20 shillings. A thumbnail, 3. Each fingernail, each toe, the big toe worth more than the others, a pierced ear versus a severed one, a bone laid bare versus a bone broken. The schedule goes on for clauses and clauses, and the reason a kingdom's founding legal text needs a tariff for a torn-off thumbnail is that these injuries were common enough in ordinary village and hall life to require standardized compensation. This is the famous Wergild system, man price, the principle that every person and every part of every person had a cash value payable to the victim or their kin, and it existed for a very specific reason. It was the alternative to the feud. Pay the price, and the injured family is made whole and honor is satisfied. Refuse or fail, and the injured family had a recognized, semi-legitimate right to come and take satisfaction out of your body and your brothers' bodies, and the feud was on, and feuds in this world ran for generations. If you want to know what a feud actually looked like from inside, Gregory of Tours preserved one in full, blow by blow, from the countryside around his own city in the 580s. And it's the single best short course in early medieval social life that exists, so I'm going to tell it properly. It starts at a Christmas party. In a village near Tours, at the Christmas feast, a local priest sent his servant out to invite some men to come drink at his house. One of the invited men, apparently already deep into the season's wine, took the invitation badly for reasons lost to history, drew his weapon, and killed the servant on the spot. That single stupid, drunken killing lit the fuse. A young local notable named Sichar, a friend of the priest, gathered armed men to answer it. The other party gathered theirs. An ambush went in, and by the time the first round was over, men were dead on both sides, and property had been looted, and one of the dead belonged to the family of a man named Cramnesind. Now the machinery I described kicks in. The local church and the Count's court pushed both sides toward a settlement, tallying the dead and wounded on each side, and setting compensation to balance the books. And the remarkable thing is that it initially worked. Money changed hands, oaths were sworn, and the feud between Sichar and Cramnesind was formally closed. Then it went further than closed. The two men, bound now by payment and oath, became genuinely close, Gregory says, so fond of each other that they often shared meals and slept at each other's houses. The killer of your kin becoming your best friend, with the corpses papered over by silver. Gregory presents this without comment, and honestly the detail is doing a lot of quiet work about how this society processed loss. It held for years, and then one night the two of them were drinking at Cramnesind's table, and Sichar got expansive, the way men do at the wrong hour of the evening, and said something to this effect. "You should thank me, brother. All that compensation I paid you for your dead relatives is what furnished this house. You'd have nothing if I hadn't killed your family." Gregory records what went through Cramnesind's mind in almost these words, that if he let this stand, if he did not avenge his kinsman now, he deserved to lose his name as a man and be called a weak woman. He put out the lights and he split Sichar's skull with his blade. Then he stripped the corpse of its clothes, hung the naked body on his fence post for the neighborhood to see at dawn, and rode off to throw himself on the king's mercy, arguing, in effect, that the insult had reopened the account and the killing was lawful balance. And the genuinely instructive part is what happened next. Because Sichar had been under the protection of Queen Brunhild, so the case went political, and Cramnesind ultimately, after some property seizures and legal maneuvering, got away with it. Cleared. That's the system working as designed. Skull-splitting as bookkeeping. Multiply that logic across every valley in Francia and you have some sense of the background rate of violence a person lived inside. And the skeletons agree. Cemetery studies across the period turning up healed and unhealed blade wounds on a startling share of adult male skulls and forearms, ordinary farmers included, the forearm cuts especially. The wound you take raising your arm over your head against a blow that's already falling. And all of that is just the villagers. The people running this world operated the same code with royal resources, and nowhere more spectacularly than the Frankish royal family itself, the Merovingians, whose 6th century domestic life Gregory documented from close range, and which comes across today like something a screenwriter would reject as excessive. The quick sketch is this. The Frankish realm was treated as family property, divided among royal sons at each death. So every generation opened with brothers, uncles and nephews holding pieces of each other's inheritance. And the family worked through the resulting disputes using the tools of the age. King Chilperic, holding the northwest, wanted a prestige marriage to match his brother Sigebert's, so he wed a Visigothic princess named Galswintha, who arrived from Spain with a mountain of treasure. He already had a mistress, a former palace servant of ferocious intelligence named Fridegund. Galswintha, humiliated, asked to go home, offering to leave the treasure behind if she could just leave. Shortly afterward, she was found dead in her bed, strangled, garroted by a slave, and everyone from Gregory on down understood on whose instruction. Chilperic wept for a few days in Gregory's dry telling, and then married Fredegund. Galswinther's sister happened to be Brunhild, wife of Chilperic's brother Sigebert, the same Brunhild from the fence-post feud, and the murder of her sister ignited a war between the two royal households that would burn on and off for 40 years and consume nearly everyone it touched. Fredegund's contribution to that war was assassination, pursued with a consistency that made her name a byword for 1,000 years. In 575, with her husband losing the war and besieged, two young men presented themselves to King Sigebert at the height of his triumph, at the very ceremony where his soldiers were raising him on a shield, and stabbed him from both sides with scrammus axes, long knives that Gregory says had been smeared with poison. The assassins were cut down on the spot, as they must have known they would be, and were traced straight back to Fredegund. She sent knife men after Brunhild, after her own brother-in-law King Guntram, after nobles who crossed her, and after Praetextatus, the bishop of Rouen, who had once defied her, who was stabbed at the altar of his own cathedral during the Easter service, in front of the congregation, and lingered long enough for Fredegund to visit his sickbed, in a scene Gregory relates with a straight face, and offer him the services of her personal physicians. The dying bishop declined the offer and told her, more or less, that God was waiting for her, and died. Nothing was ever proven against her in any forum that mattered, because she controlled the forums. The reach of it went into her own household. Her daughter Rigunth, a princess with her mother's temper and none of her mother's judgment, spent her late teens throwing her royal blood in Fredegund's face, needling her, publicly, about having been born a servant. One day, Gregory says, Fredegund invited the girl to the treasure room, opened a great chest of ornaments, invited her to reach in and take whatever she liked, and when Rigunth bent her head and shoulders into the chest, her mother slammed the lid down on her neck and leaned on it with her whole weight, and kept leaning while her daughter's eyes bulged, and the girl was very close to dead when the servants screaming brought people running to pull the queen off. Mother and daughter lived together afterward, Gregory notes, in a state of more or less constant hatred. Even by the standards of this family, the treasure chest stands out, and Gregory clearly included it because it circulated, because people told this story about their queen and believed it without difficulty. Fredegund, remarkably, died in her bed in 597, old, powerful, and undefeated, having outlasted almost everyone she had ever sent a knife after. Her rival Brunhild got the other ending. Brunhild fought on for decades after her sister's murder and her husband's assassination, ruling through sons and then grandsons and then great-grandsons. An old woman keeping a kingdom together with her bare hands, until in 613 the nobles of Austrasia finally sold her out to Fredegund's son, King Clothar II, the child of the woman who had strangled her sister. Clothar had her charged before the army with the deaths of 10 kings, a stitched-together indictment covering 40 years of politics, and then he had her tortured for 3 days. She was somewhere near 70 years old. On the last day she was paraded through the ranks on a camel for the soldiers' amusement. and then bound to a wild, unbroken horse, tied by her hair and by one arm and one leg, and the horse was lashed into a panic, and it kicked and dragged the old queen apart across the ground until what was left was, in the chronicles' words, torn limb from limb. Her remains were burned. That was a queen, a great-grandmother of kings, one of the most formidable rulers of her century, and that's how her own society disposed of her once her protection lapsed. Adjust downward from there for what it could do to you. If anything, though, the single Merovingian episode that best measures the age involves children, and I'll tell it, and then we'll come up for air. When King Clodomir died in battle, he left 3 small sons, being raised by their grandmother, the old dowager Queen Clotilde, widow of Clovis himself. The boys' inheritance, a third of the Frankish realm, sat waiting for them to grow up, and their uncles, Childebert and Clothar, kings of the other portions, decided it shouldn't have to wait. They lured the boys away from their grandmother on the pretense of preparing their royal elevation, and then sent a messenger to Clotilde carrying a pair of scissors and an unsheathed sword, with instructions to ask the queen which she chose for her grandsons. The scissors meant tonsuring, shearing the boys' long royal hair, which in Frankish culture stripped a Merovingian of his throne-worthiness, monk instead of king, alive but politically erased. The sword meant the sword. Clotilde, in her grief and fury, gave the answer the messenger carried back and that Gregory preserved, that she would rather see them dead than shorn. Historians have argued ever since about whether she understood the choice as real or was calling what she thought was a bluff. The uncles took it at face value. Clothar took the elder boy, who was 10 years old, and stabbed him in the armpit, killing him. The younger, 7, threw himself at the other uncle's feet, clung to Childebert's knees, and begged, and Gregory says the child's tears actually cracked Childebert, who turned to his brother and asked him, generous soul, to spare this one, offering to pay him for the boy's life. Clothar's answer was to threaten Childebert with taking his nephew's place. The 7-year-old was torn off his uncle's legs and stabbed like his brother. Their attendants and their tutor were killed along with them, everyone who had come with the children, and the 2 kings then divided the dead boy's kingdom between themselves. The 3rd brother, Clodovald, was hidden by loyal men and escaped, and when he was old enough he cut his own hair off with his own hands, renounced the whole inheritance, and disappeared into the church, where he ended his days as a monk of such gentleness that he was made a saint. The city of Saint-Cloud outside Paris carries his name. His brothers, 10 and 7, got a shared tomb and a paragraph in Gregory. That's the top of this society. And I want to be clear that none of it was hidden or considered unspeakable. These stories circulated in the boys' own lifetimes, told by a bishop who dined with these kings. Violence at every level, from the fence post to the treasure chest, was an acknowledged instrument of ordinary life. And in case you're wondering whether things improved when a new dynasty took over, the family that eventually shouldered the Merovingians aside ran a bigger empire on the same fuel. Charlemagne, the towering name of the whole era, the emperor of schools and scholars and reformed handwriting, spent more than 30 years hammering the pagan Saxons east of the Rhine into his kingdom and his religion, and the war was run with a ferocity his own court recorded without blushing. In 782, after a Saxon rising wiped out a Frankish force in the Suntal Hills, Charlemagne came down on the region, demanded the surrender of the men responsible, and at Verdun on the river Aller, according to the royal Frankish annals, the official record of his own government, he had 4,500 Saxon prisoners beheaded. One place, one day. A few modern scholars have suggested the annals word for beheaded might be a copyist's slip for a word meaning resettled, and the suggestion has never won over the majority, partly because nobody at the Frankish court ever showed the slightest embarrassment about the entry. It sits in the record of Christendom's greatest king the way a harvest figure would. 3 years later came his law code for the conquered territory, the capitulary for the Saxon lands, and it makes Verdun look improvised. Death for any Saxon who refused baptism, death for cremating your dead in the old way instead of burying them, and the same penalty rolled out clause by clause for eating meat in Lent in contempt of the faith and for plotting with pagans against Christians, the new religion wired straight into the gallows. Conversion, on that frontier, moved at the speed of statute law with a sword walking behind it, and the Saxons took 3 decades of it before the record finally goes quiet. Which makes it all the more remarkable that when the people of this era went looking for a name for the worst thing that could come over the horizon, the thing beyond even all this, they pointed past their kings and their emperors out at the sea. Starting in the 790s, something came out of the north that genuinely frightened a continent already fluent in atrocity, and the fear shows in the ink of every chronicle that met it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry for 793 opens with omens, immense whirlwinds over Northumbria, it says, and lightning, and fiery dragons seen flying through the air, and a great famine following hard behind. And then, on the 8th of June, the harrying of heathen men wretchedly destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. Lindisfarne was a tidal island off the northeast coast of England, home to one of the holiest monasteries in the Christian West, the shrine of St. Cuthbert, a place of books, relics, treasure, and men sworn not to fight. The ships came out of the summer sea without warning, because ships had never meant this before. Ships meant traders, and the men who waded ashore killed the monks where they stood, at their prayers, at their work, cut some down in the church itself, dragged others into the surf and drowned them, hauled the young ones aboard in chains to be sold, stripped the altars, dug up the treasury, and were gone with the tide. A scholar from Northumbria named Alcuin, then living at Charlemagne's court in Francia, got the news by letter and wrote back a series of anguished responses that survive. And in one of them he says the church of St. Cuthbert stood spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of its ornaments, given over as prey to the pagans. Never, he wrote, in the 3.5 centuries his people had lived in Britain, had such a terror appeared, and no one had believed such a voyage across open sea could even be made. That last point is the one to hold on to, because it explains the fear better than the body count does. The raid itself, by the standards of everything we covered in the last section, was small. A few dozen dead, a few dozen enslaved. Frankish kings did worse to each other on slow weekends. What Lindisfarne announced was a new species of threat, an enemy with no address. Feud logic, Wergild logic. All the machinery this world used to manage violence depended on knowing who had struck you and where their family lived. The men from the ships had no farm you could burn in reply, no kin you could summon to a court, no bishop who could excommunicate them, and they were gone before the nearest armed help could saddle a horse. Coastal and riverside Europe spent the next 2 centuries learning to live with that, and rivers are the detail people miss. The shallow drafted ships went up the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Thames, hundreds of miles inland, so being far from the sea protected nobody. Paris was besieged, Hamburg burned. In Ireland and England, monasteries were hit again and again on a schedule because monasteries were, functionally, unguarded banks with excellent road access by water, and the annals of these decades become a drumbeat of place names, and the words plundered, burned, and the entire community carried off. Iona shows what that schedule felt like from inside. The island monastery off the Scottish coast, the mother house of northern Christianity and the burial ground of kings, was hit in 795, 2 years after Lindisfarne. It was hit again in 802 and burned. In 806, the raiders came a 3rd time and killed 68 members of the community in one visit at a spot on the shore that has been called Martyrs Bay ever since, and the survivors began shifting the monastery's treasures and its founders' relics to Ireland for safekeeping, and in 825 they came again, and this time the record hands us a name. A monk called Blathmac, who had stayed on the island knowing exactly what tended to arrive with the spring sailing season, was at the altar at morning mass when the crew came up from the beach. They wanted the shrine of St. Columba, the precious metal casket holding the founder's bones, which the community had buried in a hiding place. Blathmac knew where it was. He refused to say, and they killed him on the altar steps, and a monk on the continent who heard the story from Irish travellers set it down in verse within a few years. So the account stands unusually close to the event. The shrine stayed hidden. The abbey, remarkably, kept going, staffed by men who volunteered for the posting with all of this on the record. Carried off is the phrase to stop on, because raiding for the Northmen was substantially a harvesting operation, and the crop was people. The Scandinavian world ran on slavery, on thralls, the unfree tier of society that Norse poetry describes with open contempt, bent backs, black nails, names like lump and sluggard and stinker assigned in the verses that laid out the social order. Every raid that didn't end in massacre ended in a coffle, and the captives, monks, farm boys, and above all young women, flowed into a commercial network of genuinely intercontinental scale. Dublin, founded by Norse raiders as a fortified ship camp, grew into one of the great slave markets of Western Europe, a place where an Irish girl taken from her family on Tuesday could be standing for inspection and sale by Friday, priced, handled and shipped onward to Iceland, to Francia, to Spain, or east down the Russian rivers toward buyers in the rich market markets of the south and east where the demand was effectively bottomless. Excavations in Viking Age towns and camps have turned up the hardware, iron neck fetters and chain links, purpose-built restraint for the human freight. And we'll come back to the slave trade as its own subject shortly, including one branch of it that's as dark as anything in this video. But first, we have an eyewitness to meet, because for one corner of the Norse world, we have something almost no other early medieval atrocity gives us. A literate, observant outsider standing close enough to watch. And what he watched has never really left anyone who's studied it. In 922, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled north from Baghdad on an embassy to the Volga region, and there he encountered the Rus, Scandinavian traders and settlers operating along the Russian rivers. He wrote up everything, their magnificent physiques, their tattoos, their appalling hygiene. He was fastidious, and they shared washing water, and then one of their chieftains died, and Ibn Fadlan was permitted to attend the funeral, and his report of it runs several pages and is, page for page, among the most disturbing documents to survive from the entire early Middle Ages. The dead man was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days, while his ship was drawn up on shore and prepared, and his household was asked which of his slaves would die with him. A girl volunteered. I want to be careful with that word, because everything that follows complicates it. From the moment she spoke, Ibn Fadlan says, she was treated with honor, waited on, adorned, kept drinking day after day, singing, described by observers as happy, and the structure of the thing, the beliefs everyone around her held, the drink and the total absence of anywhere to run, all bore down on whatever the word volunteer can mean for an enslaved teenager. Over the following days she was taken through the encampment, and man after man lay with her, each one telling her afterward, in the formula Ibn Fadlan records, to tell her master that this was done out of love for him. On the final day, the ship stood on its pier scaffolding. The dead chieftain dressed in silk and set up on cushions in a tent on the deck, surrounded by weapons, food, and the butchered bodies of sacrificed animals, dogs, horses, cattle, a rooster and hen, all cut apart and thrown aboard. The girl was lifted 3 times over a wooden frame, like a doorway, and each time she called out what she saw. Her father and mother, her dead kin, and finally her master, seated in a green and beautiful place, calling her to him. She was given a hen, and she cut off its head and threw it on the ship. Then she was taken up onto the deck toward the tent, and Ibn Fadlan says that at this point, close to the threshold, her composure went. She hesitated, grew frightened. An old woman the Rus called the Angel of Death, a thick, grim figure who had directed the whole ceremony, took her by the head and pulled her into the tent, and 6 men followed them in. The men outside began to beat their shields with staves, and Ibn Fadlan, who missed nothing, gives the reason so that the sound of her screaming would be covered and not frighten the other slave girls, who might otherwise refuse to die with their masters someday. Inside the tent, each of the 6 men lay with her. Then she was laid down beside her dead master. 2 men gripped her feet. 2 her hands. The old woman looped a cord around her neck and gave the ends to the last 2 men to pull. and while they strangled her, the angel of death drove a broad-bladed dagger between her ribs, again and again, drawing it out and driving it in, until the two methods between them finished the work. The nearest kinsman of the dead man then stripped naked, walked backward toward the ship with a lit brand held behind him, and fired the pyre without looking at it, and others ran forward with burning wood. And the wind rose, and Ibn Fadlan stood watching a ship, a chieftain, an entire small world of goods and animals, and a girl who had been alive an hour earlier, all going up together. A Rus man standing beside him noticed the Arab watching and said something through the interpreter that Ibn Fadlan thought worth recording. "You Arabs are fools. You take your most beloved dead and put them in the ground, where the earth and the worms eat them slowly. We burn ours in the blink of an eye, so they enter paradise at once." And then, Ibn Fadlan says, the man laughed. Every culture in this video treated some category of person as spendable, and the Rus funeral shows the Norse version at full ceremonial pitch. What it did not involve, you'll notice, is the one Viking atrocity everybody has heard of, so let me deal with the blood eagle honestly before we move to the archaeology. The rite, as the later sagas describe it, was reserved for defeated kings and great enemies, and it supposedly ran like this. The victim was pinned face down, his back was opened along the spine, the ribs were cut or hacked away from the backbone on both sides and cracked outward like wings, and the lungs were drawn out through the opening and spread across the splayed ribs, the whole arrangement being the eagle. The most famous alleged case is King Ella of Northumbria, killed in 867, supposedly served this way by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in vengeance for their father. Here's the state of the evidence, plainly. The full grisly procedure appears only in Icelandic sagas and commentaries written 3 or 4 centuries after the events. The earliest source, a fragment of skaldic verse composed much closer to Ella's lifetime, says only in its dense poetic shorthand that Ivar caused an eagle to cut Illa's back, and generations of scholars have gone back and forth on whether that line describes a ritual or is simply a standard poetic image, the eagle as battlefield scavenger, a bird carving a dead man's back, which later writers took literally and elaborated into a ceremony. Add to that a recent anatomical study concluding that the full rite as described is physically performable with period weapons, though the victim would be dead before the wings ever spread, and you have the honest picture. A real king, really killed by real invaders, and a description of how that grew in the telling across 400 years of winter storytelling, or preserved a real practice the earlier sources only glance at. The sagas were sure. The verse is 8 words. You can sit wherever you like between them. The great army that finished Ella also finished another English king, and his death comes with an account written only about a century afterward by a monk who claimed his information ran back, teller by teller, to the dead king's own armor-bearer. In 869 the army wintered in East Anglia, and the young king there, Edmund, refused in this telling to rule on as a pagan's puppet. So the Danes bound him to a tree, whipped him, and then made a target of him, putting arrows into him slowly, drawing it out until, in the monk's image, he bristled with them like a hedgehog, and then they beheaded what was left. The head was pitched deep into the brambles so the burial would be incomplete, and the story closes with the search party calling to each other through the wood and a voice answering, "Here, here, here." And the head found sitting between the forepaws of a wolf, guarded and unmarked. You can hear the hagiography humming in that last part, and historians grade the details accordingly. 100 years of telling stands between the arrows and the ink. What's solid is that a real king of East Anglia died at the army's hands that winter, that his coinage stops, and that within a generation the Danes who settled that same countryside, baptized now, were striking coins of their own in honor of Saint Edmund, the man their fathers had killed. The town that grew up around the shrine is still called Bury St Edmunds. What needs no interpretation at all is bone, and the last 20 years have pulled 2 mass graves out of the English ground that show the Viking Age with the poetry stripped off, both of them, as it happens, showing Norsemen on the receiving end. On Ridgeway Hill above Weymouth in 2009, road workers cut into an old quarry pit and found it packed with men. 50-odd bodies, and to one side, stacked separately, 51 severed heads. Every individual male, nearly all in their late teens and 20s. Isotope analysis on their teeth tracing their childhoods to Scandinavia and the far north. One man's front teeth bearing deliberately filed horizontal grooves. A known Viking Age modification, possibly a warrior's marking. They had been stripped, the pit contains not a buckle or a thread, marched to the edge, and beheaded one after another with swords, and the bones record that the executions were neither quick nor clean. Multiple blows on most necks, some needing 3, 4, more strokes, cuts biting into jaws and skulls and collarbones where the blade landed wrong, and wounds through the bones of hands, raised at the end, between the neck and the edge. The bodies went into the pit tangled, the heads were piled to one side, and the count of heads runs a few short of the count of bodies, which has left everyone studying the site with the same thought, that a few were kept or set up somewhere on stakes, on the hill beside the main road where traffic would see them. A raiding crew, or a band of mercenaries most likely, caught by the locals somewhere around the turn of the first millennium, in the years when England was drowning in Danish attack, and processed methodically in a pit with an audience. And at almost exactly the same moment those men died, something happened in Oxford that we can see from both ends, from the ground and from a king's own signature. Under the quad of St John's College in 2008, excavators found the remains of some 35 men, 16 to about 35 years old, big, robust individuals, several carrying older healed combat wounds. Their final wounds were of a different character. Blade cuts and stab wounds concentrated in their backs and pelvises. The pattern of men struck from behind, running. Some skulls split repeatedly, and many of the bones charred, burned before burial. The dating clusters around the year 1000, and Oxford happens to be the setting of a document that fits the bones with terrible neatness. In 1002, King Ethelred of England, humiliated by decades of Danish raids and tribute payments, ordered the killing of all the Danish men living in his kingdom on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, a coordinated purge of settled immigrants, neighbours, traders, families. In a charter issued 2 years later, the king himself describes what happened in Oxford without apology, indeed as justification. The town's Danes, fleeing the mob, broke into the church of St. Frideswyde seeking sanctuary, the oldest safety valve in Christian society, and the townspeople, unable to force them out, set fire to the church and burned it over their heads, and the king's charter records the Danes were to be destroyed like cockle among the wheat, weeds in the grain. The men under the college lawn, cut down from behind and scorched, may well be that congregation. Nobody can stamp it certain. Archaeology rarely gets a signed confession this close, but a signed royal document describing Danes burned in an Oxford church around 1000, and a pit of burned, backstabbed Scandinavian men in Oxford dated around 1000 sit together on the table and say what they say. The massacre bought England nothing, incidentally, and the sequel shows what living under this pressure had become by the end of our period, because Ethelred's other policy, the one that earned him 1,000 years of mockery, was paying. After a catastrophic defeat at Malden in 991, the English crown handed the raiders £10,000 of silver to go away, and they went away and came back, because the payment had turned England from a place you plundered into a place that paid salaries. £16,000 a few years later. 24,000 in 1002, the same year as St. Brice's Day, the purge and the payoff issuing from the same exhausted government in the same 12 months. 36,000 after that, and in 1012, 48,000, sums raised by taxing an already bleeding countryside, silver pulled out of every village economy in the kingdom and carried down to the ships. And the measure of it is that museums in Scandinavia today hold more English silver coins of this era than survive in England itself. And the year of that last great payment supplies one more scene worth carrying with you. During the raiding that squeezed it out, the Danes took Canterbury and captured the Archbishop himself, Alfheer, the spiritual head of England, and held him 7 months against a separate ransom of £3,000. He refused to allow it. The country was scraped raw, and he would not have more taken from it to buy back one old man, and he kept refusing. And at a feast at Greenwich in 1012, his captors, deep in wine brought up from the south, dragged the archbishop into the middle of the drinking, and pelted him with the bones and ox heads of their own banquet. A whole hall of warriors hurling table refuse at a bound elderly priest, and when he was beaten down, someone finished him with the flat-struck back of an axe. Even the Danish commander was reportedly disgusted, and the killing helped push some of the raiders into the English king's service. The archbishop went into the ground as a martyr, the silver kept flowing regardless. And within a few years, a Danish king sat on the English throne anyway, wearing everything the payments and the purges and the burned church at Oxford had failed to prevent. So the sea road ran both directions, and mercy travelled on neither. And for the captives who lived, the ones the coffles and the markets swallowed, existence continued in a legal category we should now look at squarely, because slavery in the early medieval world wasn't a Viking specialty. It was the floor of the entire European economy, and the odds that our time traveller ends up standing on that floor are a great deal higher than most people would guess. Start with the raw scale. When William the Conqueror's clerk surveyed England in 1086 for Domesday Book, counting heads for tax purposes with no ideological acts of any kind, roughly 1 person in 10 across the kingdom was recorded as a slave, and in some western counties the share ran toward 1 in 5. That's the situation at the end of our period, after generations of church pressure had already been shrinking the institution. Go back into the 700s and 800s and historians reckon the proportion higher. So picture your village again, the one you woke up in at the start of this video, and understand that several of the people you'd meet before breakfast owned nothing, not their labor, not their children, not their own bodies, and were themselves owned, valued in the law codes, at a price expressed in the same units as livestock, and that's no rhetorical flourish. The codes literally price a slave in cattle. Kill another man's slave and you owed the master compensation for damaged property, on a scale with killing his ox. The slave's own family received what the law thought their grief was worth, and in most codes that was little or nothing. The routes into slavery were varied enough that nobody was fully safe from all of them. War captivity was the classic one, and every border in this world was a slaving frontier. English raiding Welsh, Welsh raiding English, Franks raiding Saxons. Everyone raiding the Slavs to the east on such an industrial scale that the very word slave in English and half the languages of Europe descends from the word Slav. Debt took people, a bad harvest and a loan against the next one and the next one failing too, and a man could pledge his own freedom and lose it. Courts took people, penal enslavement being a standard sentence for theft in several codes, sometimes extending to the thief's whole family. Famine took people in the most direct way imaginable, parents selling children so that the child would at least be fed by someone with food, a transaction the sources treat with resignation rather than shock. And the church wrestled endlessly with whether a person could lawfully sell themselves, and the fact that the question needed an answer is the historical evidence. And birth took the most, because the status was heritable through the mother, every child born to an enslaved woman arriving pre-owned, generation stacked on generation. Every so often the sources let a single face out of this mass, and the most famous belongs to a girl called Balthild. She was Anglo-Saxon, captured or sold across the Channel as a child in the 640s, and bought, her biographer says, at a cheap price by Erchinoald, the most powerful official in the Neustrian Frankish kingdom. She grew up as a serving girl in his household and grew up beautiful. And when Erchinoald's wife died, he decided to take his slave into his bed, and the biography preserves her response, that she physically hid herself under rags in a corner until his attention moved on. It moved on far enough that she was eventually noticed by the young king, Clovis II, who married her. An enslaved foreign teenager became Queen of Neustria and Burgundy, and when her husband died young, she ruled the kingdom as regent for her small son, and here's why she matters to this section. Balthild used the throne to attack the trade that had produced her. She poured money into ransoming captives, bought slaves free in batches, and pushed through a ban on the export of Christian slaves from the kingdom, the first serious legislative blow against the traffic in Frankish history, from the one lawmaker in Europe who had personally stood at the auction end of it. She finished her life in a convent she'd founded and was made a saint. One girl out of the many tens of thousands shipped in her century, and we know her story precisely because its ending was a miracle of rarity. The unrecorded rest is the actual history. The export ban points at something worth dwelling on, the question of where all these people were being exported to, because the answer connects your muddy village to the richest cities on the planet. The great buyers of the age were the wealthy powers of the south and east, above all the Islamic caliphates, economies awash in silver with an unlimited appetite for labor, soldiers, concubines and household servants, and Europe, poor in almost everything else, was rich in bodies. Northern and eastern captives flowed south along two great arteries. The Russian rivers eastward, run by the Rus we met on the Volga, and an overland route through Western Europe toward Muslim Spain, and on that western route sat a handful of towns that grew wealthy on a very specific added service. A significant premium was paid in the markets of Cordoba and the East for eunuchs. And so certain Frankish towns developed the specialty of producing them, and we know this from a source with no reason to invent it, Liutprand of Cremona, a 10th century bishop and diplomat, who mentions with distaste that the merchants of Verdun castrated boys for the Spanish trade and made from it, in his words, an immense profit. Verdun, a cathedral town in Christian Francia, running what amounted to processing facilities where boys, mostly Slavic captives marched in from the eastern frontier, were castrated by professionals and sent on south, and the economics of it are as cold as anything in this video. Because the operation, performed with iron, without antisepsis, on children, killed a large share of them. Some estimates for such trades running well past half, and the survivor's price covered the wastage with room to spare. That was the calculation, written nowhere and understood everywhere. The bishop's disgust, you'll notice, didn't close the trade. It ran for generations, tolerated, taxed, woven into the ordinary commerce of Christian Europe, and the men who ran it went to Mass in one of the great churches of Gaul. Enough of what people did to each other for a while. Even in a year with no raid, no famine, and no plague, the world itself came for you daily. And I want to walk through the ordinary physical dangers now, the ones that never made the chronicles because they never stopped long enough to be news, starting with the one that shaped every single day of every single life. Night. When the sun went down in this world, it got dark in a way almost nobody alive today has experienced outside a cave tour. Artificial light meant the hearth, and for the better off, rushlights, dried rushes soaked in animal fat that burned for 20 smoky minutes apiece, or tallow candles that stank of the sheep they'd been rendered from, and all of it was expensive enough that ordinary households simply didn't fight the dark. They surrendered to it. Work stopped, doors were barred, and the family lay down within arm's reach of each other for 10, 12, 14 hours, depending on the season, in a blackness so total that a hand in front of your face was theory. Fire discipline was the closest thing to a municipal religion, since every roof was thatch, every wall was timber and dried mud, every floor was strewn with dry straw, and a single knocked candle could take a house in minutes and a town in an hour. The chronicles record the great towns of the age burning wholesale with numbing regularity, London several times in a century, and the later custom of the couvre-feu, the evening bell ordering every hearth covered for the night, the word that became curfew, was the eventual bureaucratic answer to centuries of waking up on fire. Because sleeping between an open flame and a straw mattress in a wooden box sealed against the cold is a wager, and this world made that exact wager every night of its existence, in every house, and steadily, in ones and families and streets, it lost. Outside the barred door, the dark belonged to other parties. Wolves were a permanent feature of the European landscape through this whole period, and while a healthy wolf in a normal year avoided people, the years we've been describing were frequently neither healthy nor normal. Famine that emptied villages fed wolves. War that left the dead unburied fed wolves and taught them, and the annals of the harder decades record packs following armies, digging at fresh graves and entering settlements in hard winters, bold in a way that terrified people who were not easily terrified. Charlemagne considered the problem serious enough to build it into imperial administration, his great estate ordinance requiring every royal manor to keep dedicated wolf hunters, the luparii, who owed the count their skins as proof of work. The fear soaked into the culture at a depth you can measure by the monsters it produced. The werewolf, the man-wolf at the tree line, and by the legal language, because the standard formula for an outlaw, a man expelled from the law's protection, declared that he bore the wolf's head, meaning he could be killed by anyone, on sight, like a wolf, no price, no feud, no questions. Society's worst human and its worst animal shared one legal identity. Mostly, though, the land killed without teeth. Water again, this time in bulk. Bridges were scarce and often ruinous, so travel meant fords, and fords meant wading rivers that swelled without warning, and drowning was, as far as we can reconstruct, the commonest accidental death of the entire medieval countryside, claiming travellers at crossings, children at ponds and wells, women at the washing places, fishermen, millers in their own races, drunk men walking home. Cold worked with it. A soaked traveller in a winter dusk with 5 miles to shelter being a dead traveller walking, and the winters of this age had teeth of their own. The chroniclers marked the monstrous ones, and the winter of 763 left its scar across the annals of half of Europe. The Irish records logging a great snow that lay on the ground for the better part of 3 months. English and Frankish entries remembering the deep frost of those years killing orchards outright. Old trees split open by the cold, rivers frozen hard enough to cross with loaded carts for weeks on end. In your village, a winter like that meant the stored food ran out with 2 months of cold left. The cow you were sleeping beside became beef in January, and the old and the small slipped away one by one in the dark, not of anything with a name, just of winter. And roads deserve a last word here, because our whole modern instinct, when things go wrong, is to go somewhere, and in this world going somewhere was itself the risk. The Roman road network still existed as crumbling stone causeways through the forest, but the Roman things that had made roads usable, patrols, posting stations, law that followed you, were gone. A traveller was a stranger everywhere, outside every local web of kin and lordship that constituted protection, carrying by definition everything he owned, and the woods knew it. Banditry wasn't an aberration of the countryside. It was one of the countryside's industries, staffed by the outlawed, the masterless, and the demobilized. And the age's answer tells you the scale of the problem, the near universal custom of sanctuary, the rule that a fugitive or a traveler who reached a church and got a hand on the door was untouchable. Civilization in this period was an archipelago, little islands of hall, village, and minster, with open water between them, and the man who set out alone across that water was accepting odds no local would envy. The Oxford Danes ran for a church, remember, because after everything, the church door was the one thing everyone still agreed on. Then their neighbours burned it. Even the last safe place had an asterisk. Suppose, against every odd we've stacked up, you simply endured, kept your feet through the fevers and the fords and the raiding seasons, year over year. The world had one more program running for you, slower than the rest, and it was written into your job. Subsistence farming is an athletic career with no retirement, and the skeletons of this period document what 30 or 40 seasons of it did to a human frame, with a precision no chronicle matches. Osteoarthritis shows up early and everywhere. Spines compressed and lipped from decades under sacks and yokes, the vertebrae of mature adults sometimes crushed into wedges from loads their bones had softened too far to carry. Men's shoulders and elbows carry the specific wear of the scythe and the axe. Women's knees and toes the signature of a lifetime kneeling at the quern, grinding the daily grain, hour after hour. And that milling posture is so consistent in the bone that archaeologists can sometimes tell you what a woman did all day from her kneecaps alone. Hernias, ruptures, backs that gave out in a world where the work could not stop for them. By the age our society considers the start of middle life, a peasant body was carrying the mileage we'd associate with old age, moving through its aches toward winters that pried at every weakness, and the parish had no pension beyond the goodwill of children who might themselves be dead. Here's what the bones say about that goodwill, though, and it's one of the few genuinely warm things this video gets to report. Early medieval cemeteries hold a steady population of people who could not possibly have survived alone, and did survive for years. Femurs snapped clean through and healed, crooked and shortened, on a person who must have been carried, fed and nursed through months of immobility in a household that could barely spare the hands. Skulls with catastrophic, plainly disabling injuries showing long survival afterward. The elderly toothless, their jaws fully resorbed, who could have eaten nothing that wasn't softened, mashed or chewed for them, kept alive winters past their last molar by somebody at the same fire. Individuals with severe congenital conditions reaching adulthood in communities that, by the cold logic we might project backward, had every reason to let them go, and didn't. None of that sits in any law code. It's just there, in grave after grave, the unrecorded daily labour of people hauling their broken and their old along with them through everything else this video has described. The same century, sometimes the same village, that would burn a corpse eater at the market and hang a 13-year-old for theft, would also spoon gruel into a grandmother's ruined mouth for a decade. Both facts are load-bearing. Any honest picture of this world has to hold the two of them at once. Everything we've covered so far attacks the body, but you'd have a mind in this world too, and the world had plans for that as well, because the people around you did not experience these horrors as random misfortune. They experienced them as messages. And living inside a universe where the plague, the famine, the dimmed sun, and your own nightmares were all understood as deliberate communications from heaven or from somewhere considerably lower, was its own distinct ordeal, and it's the one part of the Dark Ages our time traveler is least equipped to survive. Every person in your village, from the priest to the smallest child, understood the visible world as the thin part of reality. Underneath it, above it, and pressing in on it from every side was the rest, heaven and hell, and a crowded middle layer of demons, elves, spirits of the unquiet dead, and the working presence of saints, and none of that was metaphor to anyone. Disease came from somewhere, on purpose. Sudden pain was elf shot, we've covered that, an actual projectile from an actual being, and the surviving charms against it are working tools, not poetry. The suffocating terror of waking paralyzed in the dark had a name and a perpetrator, the Mara, a creature that came and sat on the chests of sleepers and rode them through the night. And it's still in your mouth every time you say nightmare. Crop failure, a cow gone dry, a child born wrong, all of it invited the question of who, and the question of who invited answers, and the answers could land on a neighbor. And over the whole system, sun to cellar, hung the largest fact in any medieval mind, that this life, the whole muddy, painful business we've spent an hour describing, was the short and unimportant part, an anteroom, and that what came after it was eternal, and that one of the two available eternities was torture without end. Hell wasn't preached in this world as an abstraction. It was described in detail with the confidence of geography, and every so often the sources hand us a tour. Bede tells the story of a Northumbrian householder named Drythelm, a decent, ordinary family man who fell sick and died one evening at nightfall, and at dawn sat up on his own bier, alive, scattering the mourners in terror, everyone except his wife, who stayed, which Bede notes, and I appreciate him for it. Drythelm told her he had been given his life back and would now be living it very differently, and then he told, eventually, what he'd seen. A guide with a shining face had walked him along the edge of an enormous valley, one side burning with a fire beyond anything earthly, the other locked in ice and driving hail, and the souls in it leaping eternally between the two, out of the flames when the burning became unbearable, into the storm of ice until the freezing became unbearable, back into the flames, forever, and beyond that valley a pit, a stinking darkness where globes of fire rose and fell like sparks over a bonfire, each spark a soul, and out of which things had come toward him in the dark before his guide returned. He was shown the pleasant meadows too, the waiting rooms of the saved, but it was the valley that reorganized his life. Drythelm gave away everything he owned, divided among his wife, his sons, and the poor, and entered the monastery at Melrose, where he became famous for one particular devotion. He would go down into the River Tweed and stand in it up to his neck, reciting psalms, in winter, with broken ice knocking against his body, and when the brothers marveled that he could bear water that cold, Bede records the answer he gave them, that he had seen colder. He kept at it until the day he died, an old man voluntarily rehearsing in a Scottish river against the temperatures of the world to come. Bede's contemporaries could match the vision with physical testimony. Over in the East Anglian fens, around the year 700, a former fighting man named Guthlac, veteran of a Mercian warband, gave up the sword and settled as a hermit on the island of Crowland, deep in the marshes, and the account of his life, written a generation later by a monk named Felix, describes what came for him there in the dark. Demons, in numbers, and Felix builds them feature by feature. Great heads on long necks, lean pale faces, filthy beards, ragged ears, wild eyes, mouths full of teeth like a horse's, throats breathing flame, voices like nothing human. They burst into his cell at night, Felix says, bound him, dragged him backward through the thorn brakes and the black marsh water until his body was torn, beat him with whips that felt like iron, and hauled him up into the freezing air to the very mouth of hell, and held him over it, and made him look. Guthlac, by the account, looked, and was rescued at the brink, and went back to his cell, and stayed. Stayed for years, alone, in the place where that had happened to him. Whatever a modern listener wants to make of marsh gas, fever, malaria, which was endemic in those fens, or an old soldier's nights, the people of his own time filed the report under plain fact. The fens held demons the way the rivers held fish, and a man who chose to live among them was performing the spiritual equivalent of pitching a tent on a battlefield during the battle. That's what belief looked like when it was total, and I bring these men in because they show you the psychological climate everyone lived in, saints and sinners alike. Every person you'd meet carried a running ledger of their soul, kept against an audit that was certain, and a sentence that had been described to them since infancy in the vocabulary of the burning valley. The Church's penitential handbooks, the confessors' manuals of the age, assign years of fasting and penance across catalogues of sin, so exhaustive they double as anthropology, years of bread and water for a killing, scaled by rank and intent, down to careful rulings on questions nobody would think to invent, including what a household should do about food a mouse has drowned in. And the answer, for the curious, was, take it out. Sprinkle the food with holy water and eat it, because food was food, and the machinery for managing the terror was everywhere, relics under every altar, the bones and belongings of the holy dead functioning as fixed points of safety in a haunted landscape, pilgrimage, alms, the whole economy of intercession. None of it is stupid, once you grant the premises, and the premises were granted universally, which means our imagined time traveler faces a problem sharper than any well or wolf. You would be on arrival, visibly and audibly wrong. Wrong tongue, wrong clothes, wrong gestures at Mass, wrong everything. In a society with no category for harmless strangeness and a rich, active category for the other kind. The best case is charity at the church door. The other cases in a bad year, in a frightened village that has just buried its children and wants to know who to blame. We've already covered what this world did when it decided someone was the answer. And if the village couldn't settle the question of guilt on its own, it had a formal procedure for asking God directly, and the procedure had your hand in it. Early medieval justice, when oaths and compensation failed, when the accused couldn't muster enough respectable neighbors to swear to his character, went to the ordeal, and the ordeal deserves to be walked through slowly, because the details are the point. Take the ordeal of hot iron, the standard for a serious accusation. The accused fasted for 3 days and heard mass. The iron, a bar weighing a pound or more, went into the fire during the service and came out glowing and was placed in the accused's bare hand, and he carried it 9 feet, measured 3 paces, in front of witnesses before he could throw it down. Then his burned hand was bound and sealed, and for 3 days nobody looked at it, and everyone involved went home and thought about it, the accused most of all, feeling the burn do whatever it was doing inside the bandage. On the 3rd day the seal was broken before the court, and the hand was inspected, and if the wound was healing clean, God had spoken for him. If it festered, God had spoken the other way, and the man went from the unwrapping to whatever punishment the accusation carried, hanging, mutilation, slavery, with his infected hand as the divine signature on the verdict. Boiling water ran the same way, a cauldron at a rolling boil, a stone or ring at the bottom, and the accused plunged his arm in and fished it out, wrist deep for an ordinary charge, elbow deep for a grave one, same bandage, same 3 days, same unveiling. And for the ordeal of cold water, they trussed the accused, bound hand and foot, and lowered him on a rope into a pond or a stream that had been blessed, the theology being that pure water would refuse to receive the guilty. Sinking meant innocent, and the rope had a knot at a set distance so the court could see he'd gone properly under before hauling him back, ideally in time. Floating meant the water itself had rejected him, guilty, and out he came to face the sentence. Take a second with the incentives on that one. The innocent man's proof was his own drowning, halted, if all went well, by prompt work on the rope. 2 more entries round out the menu. English practice reserved a special ordeal for clergy, the corsned, the trial by morsel, in which the accused priest was handed an ounce of consecrated bread or cheese, over which the fiercest prayers in the book had been said. Prayers asking in so many words that the food lock the throat of a guilty man, and he ate it before the court while everyone watched his face. Swallow cleanly, innocent, choke, gag, convulse, guilty, and given what a solemn ritual, a packed courtroom, and total sincere belief can do to a human swallowing reflex. The corsned was less rigged in the defendant's favor than it sounds. The most famous story attached to it told about Earl Godwin of Wessex choking to death at the king's own table on a morsel he'd sworn on, grew in the telling for generations after the man's actual death. So hold the anecdote loosely, but it circulated because everyone understood the mechanism it described. And where 2 free men's oaths collided head-on with no witnesses to break the tie, The continental codes offered the judicial duel, trial by combat, the two parties or their hired champions armed and set on each other before the court, on the theory that God strengthens the truthful arm. The Frankish sources record these with total matter-of-factness, including duels fought over property lines and inheritance shares, and the detail that stays with you is what happened to the loser if he survived the fight itself, because losing was the verdict, and a surviving loser was a convicted man, and the sentence for the underlying accusation was frequently carried out on the man the duel had just half killed, sometimes at the edge of the dueling ground, sometimes by hanging him from it. What waited on the far side of a guilty verdict brings us to the punishments themselves, and to a piece of reasoning that tells you more about this world's mind than any battle. Early English law, by the 10th and 11th centuries, had grown queasy about hanging thieves, and the queasiness produced under King Knut one of the most chilling, merciful clauses ever drafted. For the repeat offender, rather than death, the law prescribes that his eyes be put out, and his nose and ears and upper lip cut off, or his scalp removed, whichever of these the councillors decide, so that, and this is the stated reason, the soul may be preserved. Killing a man cut short his time to repent, and might send him to the burning valley, blinding him, carving off his face, and releasing what remained into the world as a walking advertisement for the law that left his soul its chance. It was mercy, sincerely meant, and the sincerity is the disturbing part. English kings had wrestled with the mathematics of severity for a century by then. Ethelstan's laws had ordered death for any thief over 12 years old, caught with goods worth more than a few pence, and then, later in the same reign, the king revised it, on the record, saying it seemed to him too cruel that people so young should be killed for so little, as he saw it was being done everywhere, and he moved the death threshold up to 15. Sit with what that correction implies about the years before it. A working legal system hanging 12 and 13-year-olds for petty theft, at a rate the king himself noticed from the throne. Outlawry rounded out the domestic menu. For the man who fled justice rather than face it, the law's response was withdrawal, a formal declaration that he stood outside its protection entirely, and we've already met the formula. He bears the wolf's head. From the moment of the declaration, anyone could kill him anywhere, without penalty, without compensation, and helping him, feeding him, sheltering him for a night, made the helper a criminal in turn. The outlaw kept breathing, but as a legal object he had been deleted, and the greenwood where he ran was full of men in the same condition, which loops back around to why the roads were what they were. English law made this world's other signature contribution here too, in its treatment of the corpse. Executed felons and outlaws were routinely denied burial in consecrated ground, and archaeologists have mapped the result, the execution cemeteries of Anglo-Saxon England, and the man this whole video opened with, face down on his boundary with his wrists bound and his head set down by his knees, was one entry in exactly this ledger, buried apart from the community of the dead, as he'd been cut from the community of the living, the sentence designed to continue after the heart stopped, out on the parish line, forever. The men on thrones lived under the same grammar of the body, and English royal history in the back half of the 900s shows it running at the very top. In 978, the King of England was a boy of about 16 named Edward, and one March evening he rode with a small escort to visit his little half-brother and his stepmother at Corfe in Dorset. The household came out to meet him at the gate, crowded around his horse in welcome, reached up to take his hands, and stabbed him where he sat. His horse bolted with the dying king dragging from the stirrup. The chronicle verdict on it, written within living memory, was that no worse deed had been done to the English people since they first came to Britain, and the entry records the part that stung almost more than the knife, that nobody was punished for it, nobody at all, and that the murdered king went into the ground at Wareham without royal honours, while his half-brother Ethelred, aged about 10, took the crown the killing had cleared. You've met Ethelred already. St. Brice's Day, the Danegeld, the burned church at Oxford. His entire disastrous reign ran downhill from a body at Corfe Gate, and the feeling that heaven had taken note of how he got the throne hangs over nearly every entry the chroniclers wrote about him afterward. The dead boy, meanwhile, began working miracles, as murdered royal innocents in this period reliably did, and within a generation the English calendar carried a new martyr, Edward, king and saint, whose cult his brother's court decided it was wiser to honour lavishly than to ignore. Ethelred's own court kept the older instruments sharpened. In 993 the chronicle notes, flat as a ledger line, that the king ordered a man named Alfgar to be blinded. Alfgar's offence was his father, the ealdorman Elfric, who had betrayed the English fleet to the Danes and slipped beyond the king's reach, so the sentence fell on the eyes the king could reach, the traitor's sons. And in 1014 the practice sailed home with the tide it had always ridden. The young Danish claimant Knut, forced to quit England for a season after his father's death, paused at Sandwich on his way out and put ashore the hostages the English nobility had handed his father as pledges of good faith, sons of the great families, boys and young men held against their kingdom's behaviour. He returned every one of them alive, and every one of them missing his hands, his ears, and his nose. A message written on the bodies of children about what the pledges had been worth, from the same Knut whose merciful mutilation clause we looked at a moment ago. He came back and took the whole kingdom within 2 years, and by the lights of the age governed it rather well, and contemporaries held Sandwich and the good government in their heads at the same time without apparent strain. I'll leave you to decide how well the two sit together in yours. So that's the world. And I promised you at the start a specific question, whether you'd last 24 hours in it. So as we come to the end, walk the single day with me, honestly, knowing what you now know. You wake before dawn in the smoke and the fleas, and your first act, drinking, is your first exposure. Your breakfast bread carries stone grit for your teeth and, in a wet year, possibly ergot for your veins. Your workday is agricultural labour your body hasn't trained for, among tools and animals fully capable of opening you up, in a village where your strangeness has been noticed by everyone, where you can't swear an oath, name a kinsman, or explain yourself in any tongue they know. which places you, legally speaking, nearest the category of the masterless wanderer. And you've heard what the options were for those. If you make it to dusk, the dark shuts you in a timber box with an open flame, and the 10 hours of blind night belong to the fever you may already be brewing. That's the good day. That's the day with no raid on it, no flux in the village, no accusation, no cauldron. String 300 of those days together and you're still only at year 1 of a life expectancy that, for the people born into this and hardened to it since birth, hovered somewhere in the 30s, and that figure, low as it is propped up by the survivors, because it averages in all those buried infants. The people of this world were tougher than us in every way that can be measured, from bone, denser muscle attachments, healed fractures we'd hospitalize, abscesses endured standing up, and the dark ages killed them anyway, in their millions, by every road this video has walked. Our odds are not a serious conversation. I want to end in a grave, one specific grave, because it holds almost everything this video has been about in a single square metre of Derbyshire. In the winter of 873, the Viking Great Army, the force that had spent years dismantling the English kingdoms, dug in at Repton, fortifying the church and churchyard of a Mercian royal monastery, and among the burials they left behind, excavators in the 1980s found a man archaeology knows as Grave 511, a Scandinavian warrior, powerfully built, around 40, buried with his sword and a Thor's hammer amulet at his neck. The bones lay out his last minutes without commentary, cuts to the skull, a wound through the arm, and the blow that ended it, a blade driven up into the inside of the thigh, into the femoral artery, an unsurvivable wound in any century before this one, and one that, from its track, took more of him than blood. The men who buried him understood exactly what had been done because they answered it in the grave. Between his thighs, where the wound had unmade him, they placed the tusk of a wild boar, restoring in death, in the only material they had, what the blade took, so that he would not cross over incomplete. A small bone from a jackdaw's wing went in beside it, for reasons 11 centuries have kept to themselves. And a few meters away, under a low mound, lay a charnel deposit holding the disarticulated bones of well over 200 more people, men of fighting age and women together, the army's harvested dead gathered up and stacked around one central burial. The whole hill a filing cabinet of everything we've talked about, violence and belief and disease and care, all pressed into the same cold ground. Somebody loved that man in Grave 511 enough to send a boar's tusk into eternity with him. That's the Dark Ages too. The tenderness operating right inside the horror, never more than a spade's depth apart. They stayed together down there for 1100 years, the tusk and the man, until we came along with our trowels and our tetanus shots and our clean water and gently took the lid off. And that's where I'll leave you, standing at the edge of that trench. Whatever you do after this video, tap water, painkillers, a light switch after dark. Give it 2 seconds of appreciation. It's the whole miracle, honestly. If you got something out of this one, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships are what keep these long, deep dives alive. Links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. And I see every comment. So tell me which part of this century-hopping nightmare stuck with you most, or what corner of history you want dragged into the light next. Sleep well tonight. In a bed with no cow in the room. See you in the next one.